I'm Erin Borla with the Roundhouse Foundation. I've always loved libraries and books, and before I took this job at Roundhouse, I was the lead library staff person at our elementary and middle school libraries here in Sisters, Oregon. I recognize the value that books have not only to transport and teach, but also the space a library offers in a community, because it's so much more than just books. When I stepped into that role, we opened the libraries up before and after school and during lunches, so students would have a safe space to be if they needed a break from everything they were going through. Not to mention the opportunity to open students' eyes to all the different types of books that are available. They had an opportunity to see their own experience reflected back at them, or learn about someone else's experience through their eyes and storytelling. When I stepped into this role here at Roundhouse, I sought out libraries to support. There are so many located throughout our rural communities, and I knew how hard it was to find funding for the small projects we wanted to do in the school libraries. I thought there may be a connection for Roundhouse. I found this group called Libraries of Eastern Oregon. I knew I needed to get connected. They're a nonprofit that serves and supports 39 public libraries in rural Oregon. They help share resources, learning opportunities, even a shared catalog. Stephanie Chase is their executive director, and it's been great to get to know her and the incredible work that Leo has been doing over the years. Her background in rural spaces and in supporting community gathering places that libraries are is so critical to community development. In addition to her work with Leo, she also serves on the executive board of the American Library Association, and she spent years learning about community programming, library support systems, and the importance of connection. Stephanie also grew up with a strong appreciation for the role a library plays in its community.
So I grew up in a very, very small town on the East Coast in New Hampshire. So there were under 2,000 people in the town that I grew up in. And we had a library that was volunteer run, a general store, a very small elementary school, and two churches. So actually not a lot for a town of 600, right? But when you start to think about what if you don't fit into this, right? Like what if there is not a church that is part of your faith practice, or you don't have a faith practice. So that opportunity to really connect with your friends and neighbors is not there. What if you don't have a school-aged child? And again, in a lot of small and rural communities, the only school that will really be local will be an elementary school. So if you don't have elementary school-aged children, how are you meeting other people in your community? If you don't have a general store, if there is not a place, right, to go get a gallon of milk or pick up the paper and happen to see people, where do you go? If you have a post office that's not open very often, you really start winnowing down these spaces. There are not a lot of free and open public spaces for you just to see other people. We would joke in the town I grew up in, a lot of people saw each other Saturdays at the transfer station, right, at the swap shop, at the dump. But you don't really want to spend a lot of time in the dump. And so you're really getting down to this one place, right? You're getting down to this one thing, which is typically the public library. And American public libraries are really unique in that their inception was really about being free and open to anyone, so that anyone could come through the door and access the information that they wanted to be a part of their lives. Certainly there's, all this history with public libraries. A lot of that comes around, betterment in quotes, things like that. But that idea that anyone could walk through the door, you did not need to prove anything. You did not have to tell your name. You didn't have to do any of this. You could walk through the doors and access this information. It's just really such a fundamental part. And when you think about where can I do that and how can I meet other people who want to do that, and what are the people in my community interested in, you're really at this one place, right, which is the public library, that also then typically is trying to have that space so you can sit down and read the paper or have a cup of coffee or chat with your friends or your neighbors. There's not a lot of spaces left for us to do that.
And what are rural libraries are facing sort of a different space now, where there's some challenges, and then how are you seeing that in the work that you're doing with Leo?
So I think we're lucky in Oregon I think the communities that the Leo member libraries are in are by far and away really not only accepting, but very they really acknowledge the important part that the library can play in the community. And I think when I put on my national hat, right, you see this kind of dichotomy exists where most people have this really intense love for their local library. They cannot imagine their community without a local library. But that as you kind of go more broadly, right, and kind of more philosophical, that sometimes that becomes harder to access, right? So libraries, I think, certainly have become politicized, which is a very difficult place to be because they are not a political place, but they offer service set on a very specific set of values that is about democracy. It is about access. It is about the freedom to access the information that you want, recognizing that you, right, or your family, right, you have the personal opportunity to decide what is right for you. The people who are at the library are not making those decisions for you. They're doing their best to offer a really wide array of information so that you can decide what's important to you, what you want to learn more about, if this is the right resource for you.
Yeah.
But that idea around kind of that free and open access, again, people, that's harder sometimes when it gets into this where you have libraries that are needing to really stand up and say, that also means for the things that you don't like,
Yeah.
no matter what side you are on the political spectrum. We joke, if the library doesn't have something in it to offend you, it's not doing its job because there really should be something for everyone.
Yeah.
So it's hard to be in that place, right? So when you go to your local public library and you love your library staff there, right? You love the space, you enjoyed going to story time. But in a lot of communities, again, I think we're really fortunate to see this not playing out in Oregon in the same way as in other states, that when that really comes, that communal and that community wide access, when that really butts up against or comes into conflict with somebody's real personal beliefs. There are libraries across the country, communities across the country that are really having to wrestle with that, and very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think so. So Leo, you mentioned represents the several counties on the eastern part of the state. And how many libraries is that?
39 libraries.
39. And there that's a spectrum of libraries size wise, right? Talk a little bit about what staffing looks like because if we're offering all these services, this suite of services, and the library is like run by 3 volunteers, what does that look like?
So about a third of the libraries in the service area, right? So again, you think about, everything east of the Cascades except for Deschutes County. A third of those libraries are run by a single staff person.
Hmm.
They may or may not, right, have some level of continuous volunteer help, but you're looking at a single paid staff person who is more likely than not to not be full time. So the same things that you read about, right? The things that the New York Public Library is doing or Los Angeles Public Library doing, all of those things are happening right at scale in a rural public library too. Job applications, choosing books, running story time, right? All of those things. And in a small and rural library, again, more often than not, it's one person who's really in charge of making that happen. And even when you look across, then the larger parts in the county, so Baker County, which has a county system with multiple locations, or something like Pendleton or Hood River, you're looking at libraries that are serving 25, 30,000 people right in the service area with a still relatively small staff, 7 to 10 people maybe, right, kind of covering 7-day week service and having to wear every single one of those hats and doing it in a way again where they have to be very visible in their community. So there's that extra kind of piece, right,
Yeah.
of knowing what's happening in your community and being a representative of the library in your community all the time. And then even more so, right, most libraries in the east are really doing that on relatively small budgets.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any library anywhere who has the budget they need to meet their demand.
Yeah.
But rural libraries are really having to do it all
Mhm.
with very constrained resources and often in small facilities in need of a lot of updates and are very challenged to retain staff because the pay is low. And I think, again, we're often really looking to how can we help take something off that person's plate, right? Because in these small and rural libraries, the more that can happen, right, because of collaboration, because of shared resources, shared programming, having a network where you can pass information from one library to another, that just frees up the time for that staff person, that library person, to really be engaging with their community, which is the most meaningful thing that we can really help support.
Yeah. What are some of the coolest programs that you've seen that your some of the libraries you've worked with, or even in different places? I know um, you've been in libraries for a long time. I mean, you
Long
started
time.
there east, and then we're here in the more metro area. So, I mean, you've seen it all. What's been some of the coolest stuff?
For me, I am a huge fan of the library of things because I think, again, those same principles that really exist around I need access to something to help, right, to get me from point A to point B. Might not need that resource once I'm at point B, right? There's something else I need. And the idea that I could go to the library and like check out a dehydrator, right? Or, check out a cider press or a metal detector or something like that that I might only need once, and that will help me do the one thing I need to do, or help build my confidence to be like, you know what, like, oh, I could invest in this, and now I know what to look for. Why wouldn't we do that with physical items the same way that we do with electronic, resources or books? So I love the library of things, and again, that's a you see that across the country, and people have the coolest stuff. I remember the American Library Association president was doing a tour, and she went to a library where you could check out carpet cleaners, like a
Oh,
rug shampooer, right? I mean, why not go
right.
to the library instead of the grocery store? And then for me, I really love seeing how libraries interpret what their communities need. And so the real switch, I think that, or the real focus that you've seen in public libraries of really trying to meet patrons and community members where they are. So as opposed to being like, how do we get people into the library? How do we get people into the library? You think, where do people in my community have an information need? And how can I help meet that need? And that it does not have to include coming into the physical library. I love just seeing how people interpret that.
Mhm.
So, sometimes you have like really cool pop up libraries, or you have libraries taking really active roles in, community events. I'm working with a library that's based in Arkansas that has a really strong relationship with their local organic farming community to really help support their after school feeding program. So the majority of their libraries, they have a very robust after school food program, recognizing the majority of the kids in their service area, once they leave school, don't have access to food at home. So there's some of those branches that feed a couple hundred kids every afternoon, right?
Mm.
And they're doing this in partnership, right, with the school district, but also with these local farmers. Like, what a cool way to meet this really significant need in a community, and right, to do it in a space where it's very low stakes, right? Again, these kids libraries are viewed as a safe place to come, a place where kids can gather. So I think that that's what's really exciting is that when you think about not the stuff that kind of like everybody's doing the same kind of across, but when you have something that comes up in a community and the library says, "Oh, we can help with that." And we went to visit the library in Blue River, Oregon, which is rebuilding after the fires. And the library chair talked about, the woman who originally funded that library. That library is all run by volunteers. She started running the library like on her front porch, and then it was like in her living room, and then they like built a shed, kind of kept going down that path. And she said, it's like every town needs a post office, a library, and a tavern. And the recognition that the library, those group of volunteers had of, if we want our town to be reborn, right? Everything has burnt down. What's the first most visible thing that should come back up, that should physically exist to help
Mm.
our town feel like a town again? It's a library, and they worked really hard to raise funds to build a beautiful new library. They're almost done with it, and I think like that's an amazing response, right, to a very specific community need, to say We need to show people it's worth investing in this town again.
Yeah.
And one of the most visible ways we can do it is by having like a beautiful community funded, community run open public space. That's a public library. And so I think in every library, in everything they do, trying right to kind of have those multiple layers, and
Yeah.
saying, how not do we just provide, right, like access to a food dehydrator, but help people, learn more about the extension, or save money, or have this be the first breadcrumb right in a trail that might lead to a level of self-sufficiency that they're looking for. Always trying to put all of those layers into the things that we do, again, so that the person who's coming in, that recognition that the person that's coming in is a real individual and can kind of pull the thread that's the most meaningful for you.
hmm Well, and I think that stems into, library's bigger purpose of creating the importance or providing the space for literate and informed citizenry, right? And
Hmm.
why that institution is so critical to that space. And now we're seeing so much adaptation with technology and other things where oftentimes we're not thinking as journalistically maybe as we were before.
Hmm.
Maybe that's not the right term. We're
Hmm.
not thinking as critically or because the information is so readily available to us.
Yes. Yes.
And so to be able to have a space where let's have a dialogue about that, let's talk about why there might be somebody that thinks differently and what does that look like.
Hmm.
Are you seeing other ways that the libraries that you work with have stepped into that role?
Well, I think libraries have long really been a place that's really about civic connection, right? So, about that responsibility, that civic responsibility we have to the community that we belong. And some of that is a big space in terms of like, are you registered to vote, right? Do you know who your representatives are? How can you engage with the people who are representing you in government? So, I think always a recognition that libraries have that space to play. And then I think again, right, going over to that personal level of how do we help remind people. I think this piece about misinformation and disinformation, right, is something that's really challenging for libraries. I started 25 years ago. People just really, you didn't use the internet, right? Like it existed, but everything that I did in my first library job was really use books, right? And had access to resources that people did not have access to in their homes. So it's a very easy call to come to the library. But people come to the library now having dug deep often, right, into something, and the library has to try to pull them back out to, where's the information that is most trustworthy? What does it mean for information to be trustworthy? And how does having access to trustworthy information make you, right, a more informed a citizen, someone who's better able to participate in your community? It's like that's a heavy load. Right,
Yeah.
it's a heavy load, but that's why information is so important, and why you do see why having access to unfettered access, right, to information, and someone to help you wade through it.
Because now it's just at our fingertips, right? The snap
Mhm,
of a
mhm,
finger and you get
mhm.
5,000 results.
Yes.
And oftentimes we talk about when we're talking about journalism or other things, it's like how do we know which source is correct and who's buying
Mhm,
what? And so having
mhm.
those trusted community members that are in a library or places similar that can help us filter in a way, I think is really, really critical. And then providing the programming that goes alongside that with, hey, did you want to know more about this?
Right.
Here's an activity.
One of the real losses that I think we'll continue to feel as a society and in our communities as school library support really gets peeled away. Because a lot of that information literacy, that media literacy work is and was happening in school libraries. I spent
Mhm.
time as a school librarian, and I remember, in an elementary school, and it was at that time, when you get like a lot of those pop-ups would pop up. And I remember a kid in the class said, "Oh, Mrs. Chase, I just want $1 billion," right? And then this other right little secretary was like, "Oh yeah, Mrs. Cheese, I just want $1 million too," right? And because we were in a space where we could have a conversation about it, we could talk about. No,
Mhm.
nobody wanted $1 million. What were they? What could they want from you? Like, what do you think they want when you click on that button? And how do we
Mhm.
be careful about our information and what we're giving away? And how could you tell if this was legitimate? A lot of students are having to find those things out on their own. So, that media and digital literacy piece is just so crucial in an environment where
Mhm.
you have all sorts of things coming at you.
What are other ways that philanthropy and other funders could step in and support events and activities or other things at the libraries?
I mean, I think seed money is so important, right? I think a lot of times, and it's like with the library of things, you don't need a lot of money. You need $1,000, you need 2,500 bucks to try to get something up to start. And then often, right, like the visibility, and if it was really meaningful for your community, then the community will start to come together to really support it. So I think it's so important that innovation money for anybody who's listening, right, who is on the budgeting side with the government, there's not a lot of flexibility in a local government budget. That money is all working as hard as it can, going where it needs to go. So even if even if it might not seem like it, so that a small rural public library does not have play money, right? Like there's not fun money. You can see this need pop up in your community, and you will not have the money allocated to you through your government funds to be able to meet that need. And that's why like those 500, 1,000, $2,500 kind of small gifts are great in just being able to be like, oh gosh, I can buy this. I could
Hmm.
try this. And then I think too, because the structure around rural public library service is so financially challenged, libraries really need access to funds that are about improving their physical facilities. Most libraries have long deferred maintenance, and they're being asked to be warming and cooling centers, without the appropriate tools. So there's that piece, and there's just the operating piece, right? And I think it's hard. I think we've seen this a little bit more, right? You have a move in philanthropy to really support operating, but that's not flashy. If you have someone who's working 3/4 time and you can get them to full time and have benefits, that's not an inexpensive investment, but it will change that person's life and give them that time to give back to their community. That operating support is just so crucial. And I think I know you've talked about it, and I think talked about it on podcasts too, that philanthropy building a relationship with the groups that it's funding and really working on that trust so that you trust that the organization is going to use the funds in the most meaningful and impactful way, and that they trust that you're going to support them in those decisions really means that money is going where it needs to go best. Maybe it's benefits, maybe it's a window air conditioner, maybe it's food to give to every kid who comes to a summer reading program all summer. A lot of the things that libraries need are not really, they're not flashy, and so they become very, very hard to
Yeah.
fundraise for or obtain funding for, and there's just no wiggle room in most libraries' budgets.
So, well, thanks for spending time today. I know I so enjoy chatting with you all the time. It's always my favorite.
Oh my gosh, likewise. You could not ask for a better library champion, so thank you so much.
To be called a library champion, I think that's something I've always dreamed about. That's really exciting. How can I show up for folks in a way that is just makes them feel like we're a champion? That's awesome. We didn't spend a ton of time diving into the work that libraries do outside of those traditional services, broadband for job applications, supporting communities and community members who can't fill out healthcare applications, different learning models. I talked to a librarian at one point and she said, the majority of my job is helping people fill out forms because people are coming to those spaces to use that access and have someone walk them through a form or a program that they're trying to apply for. There's opportunities with socialization of young children, with story time, for moms and caregivers to connect with other families. There's so many roles for a library to take. And I love that we touched on how philanthropy can really think about small, innovation-style grants. Just attempting a project that are outside of a traditional budget. It's $1,000, it's $2,500. And yeah, that can be a real stinker when you have to fill out the same amount of paperwork in a philanthropic organization for a small grant. But man, those can be really helpful, and they can really leverage opportunities and experiences for folks that want to just try something on the ground. There's this misconception, too, that I've encountered in the philanthropic communities about where library funding comes from. So many people think that all of their funding comes from government, special district, city, county, or tax dollars, right? And that's wrong. The median revenue for rural fringe libraries, the last time this was studied, which was in 2011, was $175,000-ish. For rural remote libraries, the median revenue was $53,000. That's a blind spot and a huge opportunity for philanthropists to try and support new things, communities in need, trying to meet community needs, to see people where they're at, to attempt new projects for real innovation. Thanks again for listening to Funding Rural. You'll see all sorts of show notes, transcripts from the episode, and everything at fundingrural.com.